Hi, everyone. So welcome to another ESSIC seminar. I'm subbing for John Yang again, our seminar coordinator. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Julie Nicely today. So Dr. Julie Nicely is currently an assistant research scientist with ESSIC and performs research at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt. She specializes in investigations of Earth's tropospheric chemistry by utilizing a variety of observations and techniques to interrogate global atmospheric and Earth system models. She has also participated in multiple airborne field campaigns, providing chemical forecasts for flight planning and analyzing data collected in real time. Prior to joining ESSIC in 2019, Dr. Nicely was a fellow in the NASA postdoctoral program at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. She completed degrees in chemistry at the University of Maryland and Duke University. Let's please welcome Julie Nicely.
Thank you very much, Cassie. Get my microphone set here. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, excellent. All right, so I'll be speaking today about probably my favorite research topic, the primary oxidant of the atmosphere, otherwise known as hydroxyl radical. So I'm a chemist by training, so that's why you see all of these molecules down in the corner of the screen. But while at NASA, I've done a lot of studies working with satellite data, models, as well as aircraft data, trying to understand this chemical, because as you'll see, it's not an easy molecule to understand. So, just as a quick roadmap of where we'll be going through this talk, I'll give you a little bit of background, why we care about the primary oxidant. Mostly that is methane, in my opinion. I'll also give you a little bit of context to understand the chemistry of hydroxyl radical. And in this case, I don't want to overwhelm you with too much chemistry, so I promise I'll keep it quick and simple. And then we'll talk about some of the big outstanding issues that surround this topic. And then I'll talk about three of my main research projects that have focused on hydroxyl radical. One will focus on understanding it from a satellite perspective. A second will look more closely at global models and trying to understand model differences. And a third will start to look into the airborne data that we have available to us. And finally, I'll end with some notes on the best ways to move forward on this topic. There we go. All right, so I'm sure you've all seen a version of this chart at some point, but I wanted to emphasize here that methane is of significant interest here. We usually refer to it as the second most important anthropogenic greenhouse gas. So you can see it highlighted in blue here. It's exerting about 1/2 watt per meter squared, which is a fraction of that from CO2. However, if we want to mitigate near-term climate forcing, they also, IPCC also published this other plot that shows on a 20-year time horizon the effect of these various forcers. And you see here, methane is a much bigger factor. So understanding methane and perhaps mitigating its emissions now could be a really effective means of curbing near-term climate change. So it's a really important factor to understand and to consider going forward. But methane has recently been increasing in the atmosphere. This plot on the right shows the time series from NOAA. And here in the late 1990s and early 2000s, we thought methane was leveling off. We thought it was going to stop growing in the atmosphere. It was just reaching an equilibrium and steady state. So we thought this was good news. We can bank on methane being steady from here on out. But then in the late 2000s, it started climbing again. And there's a lot of debate on why that is. We really don't have a good handle on why methane is rising. This is a nice popular article in Wired magazine that talks about all of the nuance, probably a little bit more than I'll be talking about here, but it's a really important issue that's gaining public notice now. So why is this a problem? Like I mentioned, methane is a good target for mitigating near-term climate change. And if you consider all of the representative concentration pathways, essentially the emission scenarios that we feed our climate models, the only one that shows methane increasing substantially is the worst case scenario, this so-called RCP 8.5. And if you look at how methane emissions have been evolving over time, these circles here show the data and the background methane concentrations. We're coming pretty close to meeting that RCP 8.5 condition. So this is bad news. And very recently, a paper by Nisbet et al. Points out that we might be in danger of not meeting the Paris Climate Agreement simply because of methane. So this is something we really need to get a handle on. And where could all of this methane be coming from? Here's a nice global methane cycle map from the IPCC, and you can see all of these arrows. There's a lot of emission sources of methane, some of which are anthropogenic, but not all. Just to zoom in a little bit here, you can hopefully read these a little bit better. You can see things like livestock emit methane, fresh waters, wetlands, landfills, fossil fuels. So there's a large variety of sources. But which of those is to blame for this recent rise in methane? Well, there's pretty much every possible explanation in the literature right now posed as a hypothesis. So there's evidence that rising fossil fuels, or that livestock emissions could be causing this methane rise. Also, increases in fossil fuel production. And wetland or biomass burning emissions could be reducing. This is a nuanced argument concerned with the methane, the isotopes of methane. But then also the wetlands emissions are posed in this article as the primary source. And actually a decrease in fossil fuels is posed in this article. So there's a huge variety of explanations in the literature, many of which are conflicting. But this really only looks at the source side of methane. So these are all, what are methane emissions doing? But there's a whole other piece of this picture, and that is the sink side of methane. So methane is primarily lost by hydroxyl radical, the main oxidant in the atmosphere. And this body of literature is almost equally large. There's a lot of articles I didn't include here, but a lot of people are attributing the rise in methane to changes in the methane sink. And so that's where I come in. That's where my research focuses. And I'm trying to understand how OH evolves over time, among other questions regarding the primary oxidant. So let me give you a brief introduction to hydroxyl radical, that oxidant that I keep referring to. So I'll often be referring to it as OH. That's the chemical formula. It's pretty simple. And it's often referred to as the detergent of the atmosphere. I think that's a little bit simplified. It also leads to tropospheric ozone formation, which is a pollutant, and it hurts human health. So in that sense, it's not necessarily cleaning the atmosphere in all cases. But this is generally a good way to think of it. And what I mean by OH being the primary oxidant is that OH just reacts with, transforms, and in many cases destroys a lot of the gas phase pollutants that we put into the atmosphere. It can also do things like age and change the properties of aerosols. So it's a really involved little molecule in the atmosphere. But just because it's simple in its chemical formula doesn't mean it's easy to understand. Because it's so reactive, it's very short-lived, so it only lives about 1 second for a single molecule before it turns into something else. And this makes it very difficult to measure. You can imagine if you make an instrument, it can react on the inlet of your instrument. It can react with many of the gas phase species that you're bringing into your instrument. So it's not easy to measure, though it's possible. And it's also very heterogeneous over spatial scales. So for something like the lifetime of methane that we're trying to understand, it's really difficult to know what OH across the globe on the global scale is when you can only get point measurements here and there. It's a difficult problem. And now to jump into a little bit of OH chemistry, and this is just a little crash course for, I think, what the minimum you need to know without getting too in depth. But first, OH is produced, we call it primary production, by the photolysis of ozone. And this has to be by UV light, less than 336 nanometers, leading to an excited state oxygen atom, this O singlet D term here. Then the excited state oxygen reacts with water vapor to produce 2 OH radicals. So that's the primary way we get OH formed in the first place? So this depends on UV light, tropospheric ozone, and water vapor. Those are the 3 ingredients you need. Then on the other hand, you lose OH by reaction with things like CO and methane, but also a whole host of other volatile organic compounds, or VOCs as I'll be calling them. So in this case, CO serves as a sink for OH, just as OH serves as a sink for CO. But in the case that you have NOx present, you can actually recycle the OH from that reaction. So in general, we think of CO and methane as sinks of OH, but if it's in the presence of high enough NOx concentrations, you do regenerate that OH. So NOx is, in essence, a secondary production pathway for OH. And here I have kind of a manual animation that you can see what the OH distribution looks like over the globe, well, as we know it from models, at least. But you can see that the OH is really focused in the tropics. This is where you have the highest UV light penetration to the troposphere, because that's where the lowest overhead ozone column is. But you also see hot spots and low spots that are associated to varying degrees with cloud cover, with a lot of VOC emissions that are just eating up the OH over time. I guess another factor I didn't mention is the high OH in the tropics is also a result of the water vapor. There's much higher water vapor and specific humidity in the tropics as well. So that's kind of a brief overview of OH. Now, what are the issues and the big questions surrounding it? So we already mentioned the question of why is methane going up? That's a big question. That's a hot topic right now. But there's other issues. One of them is simply, what is the lifetime of methane? And you'd think this would be pretty easy to understand, but it turns out that our current observational best guess is about 11 years, whereas models say it's closer to 9 or 10 years. Actually, in the models I've been investigating lately, it's even shorter. It's more like 8 years. So this 10, 15, 20% difference in the methane lifetime will have large implications for how we model climate change due to methane in the near and far future. Second, models themselves, just looking amongst the group of global models, they differ a lot. You can see in this plot on the right that a group of models, each color represents a different model, is tasked with using all of the same emissions and simulating what it thinks the methane lifetime is. And you can see the models for year 2000 have a very large spread. This spread it's hypothesized to be due to this or due to that, but it's yet to really be quantified. No one has really quantified how much, say, NOx might be playing an impact on these OH differences. And I'll note here, too, that when I say OH differences and methane lifetime, I usually mean the same thing. These are indirectly related quantities. If you have more OH, then the lifetime of methane goes down, and vice versa. So just a nuance of terminology here. So that's another issue. And then what will happen to OH in the future? This is a case where we're looking at this worst case emission scenario that I noted before. This is the best agreement that the models get. If you look at the other emission scenarios, the sign of change is very different. In this case, I think 3 models disagree with the rest. Most models say methane lifetime is going up, but there are 3 models that say it's going down in this case. So another important question. And finally, is OH varying much over time, or is it pretty constant? And this is one of the observation-based studies using something called methyl chloroform. I won't get into that too much, but you can think of that as a proxy for OH. It's lost primarily by OH, and so we can infer how much OH we think is in the atmosphere. But based on these measurements of methyl chloroform, early studies said there were swings in OH as high as 20 or 30% from year to year. But later studies say that that variability, the interannual variability, is closer to 2, maybe 5%. So which is the case, and what is the impact for methane lifetime? All right, so now we get into my work. This is an overview of four projects that try to understand the answers to some of these questions. So the first one that I'll focus on is trying to tie our knowledge of OH to satellite measurements. Now, I said in my title, we do not have satellite measurements of OH, and I should nuance that by saying that we actually do have OH satellite observations, but they are up in, I think, the upper stratosphere and mesosphere. So what we're talking about is all in the lower atmosphere and the troposphere. That's where we care about loss of these greenhouse gases and pollutants. All right, so this first project I'll be discussing, the objectives of it were to empirically model the variations in OH over time, relying as much as possible on observations and on the fundamentals of OH chemistry. So we can write out things like reaction rates and the pathways of these various reactions and get these relationships that we can perform mathematical manipulation on. So that, in essence, we're mimicking one of these big global models, but in a way that we really understand what we're doing. The global models are mixing so much chemistry and meteorology that it starts to get confusing to parse these processes. And another element of this analysis I won't talk about too much is the potential effect of Hadley cell expansion on OH. There are some reasons why we think that could occur, but I won't go into those. We find this is a small effect, just to give the plot away. So the observations that we rely on for the study are total ozone columns, of which we have plenty. We use an SBUV, COMS, and OMI combined data set for these values. We also have water vapor measurements available, though from the atmospheric infrared sounder, we only have those available since the year 2002. So we end up relying on a reanalysis data set prior to that, the MERA-2 reanalysis, to go all the way back to our start year, 1980. And finally, we have observations of methane. These are actually from a ground-based network, the NOAA Cooperative Global Air Sampling Network, that almost goes back all the way. To get from 1983 to 1980, we simply interpolate the seasonal variation back to that year, following the trend line. And once we have these observations compiled, we can then try to figure out how does OH change with these factors. So what we've done is we've used a box model to calculate sensitivity. So for instance, how does OH change with a certain change in methane? And we do this on a slightly more sophisticated scale. So we do this across chemical regimes. So your sensitivity in the lower troposphere and the tropics will be very different from in the upper troposphere at the poles, for instance. And once you have that sensitivity, you can simply multiply that by the change in the factor you're examining and get a change in OH. And I should mention, too, we start with an OH field from a model simply because, I mean, that's what we've got. That's our best knowledge of what OH looks like on the global scale. From there, we calculate the delta OH values. We sum this globally to a global mean OH, and the results of that are shown here. So this is tropospheric mean OH concentration across all years, 1980 to 2015, and it's split up according to the response to each of these factors. So for instance, we saw that methane is mostly climbing up over this time frame, and the effect on OH is a drawdown in response. So that's a pretty large negative effect on OH. However, these other factors that we examine, the water vapor, the overhead ozone, and the NOx, all impart enough of a positive influence to counter that negative trend from methane. So if you take the sum of all of these lines, you get this very wiggly line. It turns out to be very small absolute values, and the slope of this line is indistinguishable from zero. So the takeaway message from this is that OH is very well buffered, we believe. And this is a little bit unexciting of a result, but if you put it into context with a lot of these other studies I talked about earlier, some of which, like the Rigby et al. Study and the Turner et al. Study in red and orange, they are finding a large perturbation to OH starting in the late 1990s. And we don't see that. Our line is this purple line that's kind of bouncing around through the gray box here. So this is a pretty important result in terms of what's happening to methane. So this is a pretty simplified approach, but in order to really get all of the chemical coupling in the system, you might use a global model. In this case, we compared to the Goddard global model, GMI. This is a CTM, so using the same meteorology for this time period. And you see in the green line that it really shows the same kind of level of interannual variability. We certainly don't follow all of the wiggles, but the maxing out at about 2 or 3% of interannual variability is pretty consistent. And the green GMI model also does not show a significant increase in OH like these other studies do. So we think this is a very interesting finding that some should consider moving forward. So these are the conclusions I just mentioned. I won't dwell on them too long. But instead, I'll move on to the second area of focus, which is to understand OH by using global models. So in this case, I'm examining a suite of global models that participated in a model intercomparison project known as CCMI. This is the Chemistry Climate Model Initiative. And for this project, I'm looking at 12 free-running models in addition to 10 models using specified dynamics. So the free-running models calculate their own dynamics, so they might have an ENSO in a year that is not realistic. But these specified dynamics models actually use meteorology from SAMARA 2, so you can expect them to be a realistic historical record in terms of their meteorology. And the main goal of this work is to quantify the factors driving the difference in methane lifetime. This plot shows methane lifetime versus month. There is a seasonal cycle that we often see in models, that we have some reason to believe that should not be the case in the true atmosphere. But you can see that the spread is anywhere from down around 6 years up to about 8.5 or 9 years. So this is a large spread. So what's driving that? And then second, a new factor that I've included is what are the factors in these models that are driving the interannual variability. And the method that I've developed to do this is a machine learning method. So this, I'm using neural networks. This is an example of the neural network architecture that I use. And in essence, I train a neural network to reproduce the OH chemistry from a given model. So on the left, you see the inputs that I feed into the neural network. And on the right is the output OH. So these are 3D fields coming from the model, and these are monthly mean fields for a given month. So every model month will have a neural network, is the layout of this approach. And then once we have this neural network established for a given model, we can play this game of, what if you take the CO field from one model and put it into the neural network of another model? What will be the impact on the OH, and what will be the impact on the methane lifetime? So this allows us to do these very computationally efficient experiments with the models that would be very difficult to do with these large modeling groups, the large models that are much slower to run, that are spread out across the world. So we think that we've found an interesting method to deal with this problem. And so one example of how we might understand the model differences is to look at this example for JO singlet D. So JO singlet D is the photolysis frequency of ozone going to O singlet D. So that's at those UV wavelengths. So in essence, you can think of this as a measure of the UV light getting into the troposphere. This is a subset of the CCMI models showing JO singlet D for the 850 hectopascal level. You can see there's a lot of difference in these fields. It's a little bit alarming. But even if you focus down on two models that we kind of believe. So on the top left, is the NCAR model CAMChem. On the top right, we have our Goddard model GeoCCM. And at first glance, these look like pretty similar fields, right? They both show the band of red through the meteorological tropics. This is January, I should mention, so that's why the tropics look shifted a bit south. But once we do the neural network analysis, we highlight where OH and JO singlet D differ. So this is showing the change in tropospheric OH columns resulting from simply swapping those JO singlet D fields between these two models' neural networks. So here you see a lot of blue over the continents in the CAMChem neural network, for instance. You see the opposite in the other model. You see red over the GeoCCM continents. If we go back, we do in fact see differences over the continents in the JO singlet D field. So this we think that this OH result pointed us to an important difference. And then the other feature that really jumps out to me is this large difference at the high latitude southern oceans. So again, we see a much higher OH in the CAMChem neural network when we put in the GeoCCM JO singlet D values. And sure enough, down here approaching 60 degrees south, you see that CAMChem is already in the green colors for JO singlet D, versus GeoCCM is still in these red colors. So these are presumably JO singlet D differences that are important for OH. We do all of these swapping, all of these swaps over all of the variables that are input to the neural network. We also do this between all of the model pairings. So you can imagine we get a lot of results from this. But to condense the results, to kind of aggregate them, we pull out these numbers. These are change in the methane lifetime numbers that result from these differences in OH. So in this case, you actually have a lot of canceling between the decreases and increases in OH. So you get a pretty small change in the methane lifetime. But if you aggregate all of these results for all of the variables, you come up with a kind of an overwhelming plot like this, but it's really jam-packed full of information. So we see on the x-axis all of the variables that are swapped in this analysis. And on the left are the variables that are driving the biggest differences in the methane lifetime for these models. So the y-axis is the mean delta tau methane change in methane lifetime resulting from swapping the indicated variable into the neural network of the indicated model. So you can see the spread just visually is biggest in these variables over here. It starts to dwindle in the middle, and it's really quite small over here. The mechanism term on the far right is actually a remainder term that we think is indicating some differences in the actual chemical mechanisms of the models. But simply based on differences in these precursor fields, we think that we describe a lot of the difference in the methane lifetime. So the UV radiative environment, as well as tropospheric ozone, NOx, and to some degree water vapor seem to be driving the biggest differences in methane lifetime for these models. Now, the other analysis that we've conducted with these neural networks is to understand the drivers of OH variations over time. So now, instead of swapping the variables between models, we stay within one model, and we swap in a variable from a different year. So for instance, this blue point right here indicates what happens if we swap in CO for year, 1992 or so, into the year 2000 neural network. So I didn't mention all of the neural networks were trained on year 2000 output. So that, by definition, is zero value for all models, or for all species, rather. And then going back in time, you see these effects of all of the species, CO standing out as having these very large spikes, but then other variables showing pretty considerable trends over time that are very interesting. So for instance, ozone is shown in the golden line, and it's generally climbing down over time. So if methane lifetime is decreasing, that means OH is going up, and OH would go up because of an increase in tropospheric ozone, which is, in fact, what various metrics of tropospheric ozone have shown. So you also can pick out effects of things like strong ENSO events and Mount Pinatubo from this plot. So the spikes in CO are associated with strong El Niños that lead to biomass burning and emission of CO. The CO then can eat up the OH and cause OH to dive during that time, at least according to the models. So it's an interesting approach to understanding the similar trends that we examined before. If we were to fit each of those lines with a simple trend line, we get the following trends in methane lifetime. So this is shown as a percent per decade quantity for each of these variables. And you can see that some stand out as really driving pretty significant decreases in the methane lifetime. So ozone I mentioned, but also water vapor, JO singlet D, and NOx. And CO shows up mostly as driving a lot of interannual variability. I think during this time series, if you look at the trend, CO is kind of trending up for a while, and then it comes back down during the second half of the time series. So because of that, you don't see an overall trend, but instead mostly those spikes show up in the large error bars as interannual variability. But now we have these trend numbers due to each of these factors. And if you recall from the satellite work I showed before, we came up with similar numbers from that analysis as well. So we can compare the two. And we find that for most of the factors, we get a pretty good agreement. I was encouraged when I first saw this. But I think most remarkably, water vapor down here is driving one of the strongest trends. So it's a negative trend in methane lifetime or a positive trend in tropospheric mean OH. And that's because water vapor is increasing in the troposphere over time as temperatures rise, and the Clausius-Clapeyron equation is maintained, and so water vapor rises as well. And as a result, you get more OH. So we think this is a pretty robust result that we think warrants probably further research. But also the effects due to NOx, water vapor, and ozone column are not too far off either. Now this methane point lies pretty far from the 1 to -1 line. And we think we know why this is. In the neural network analysis, we actually normalize the methane values because methane is usually treated as a boundary condition in global models. You can have like a very flat-looking methane field, to put it one way. So methane will be almost constant at the surface for a lot of these models. And if another model uses a slightly different value for their boundary condition, you're going to have like a range of methane values that really don't overlap between the two models. And with the neural network method, that causes problems. If you extrapolate the neural network outside of the range on which it was trained, then you can start to get some very unrealistic OH responses. So for that reason, we normalize methane. And then as a result, we really don't believe this result indicates changes in the methane abundance. Instead, it is an indication of the methane distribution within the troposphere and how that's changing over time, which we really don't expect it to change much over time. So long story short, we think water vapor is having a very interesting influence on OH and methane lifetime. And so these are just some conclusions from that work that I've gone over, but I'll emphasize this final point that so far this is all intermodel comparison, so there's no ground truth element introduced to this analysis yet, but it's something that I fully realize would be the most useful thing to include going forward. So we've been working on this. This has proven to be a little more difficult than we anticipated, but it's a fun project, and hopefully it can continue in this vein. And so finally is a combination of really a couple of projects that incorporate airborne observations. So how can we understand OH using aircraft data? So the first project that I undertook using aircraft data involved the Contrast Aircraft Campaign. So this stands for the Convective Transport of Active Species in the Tropics. This was an NSF-funded campaign that took place in winter of 2014 and was based in Guam. So as a graduate student, I had the great fortune to go out and participate in this campaign. It took place on the Gulfstream 5 or G5 aircraft, and it obtained measurements really throughout the troposphere. It was a great data set that included a lot of chemical instrument payload, or it included a payload of many chemical instruments, and as well as radiative and physical parameters that are needed to understand OH. Now, the airplane did not sample OH, which is a big drawback. Ideally, it would have included an OH instrument, but there just aren't that many OH instruments. They take up a lot of room, so it was one that had to be excluded, one measurement that had to be excluded. But what we can do, since the aircraft measured pretty much everything else that we need to understand OH, is we can run a box model and input all of this aircraft data to try to understand what OH probably would have been had we been able to sample it. And this particular region in the tropical Western Pacific, or TWP, you might see it referred to, this is a really interesting region because OH was predicted to be very low here. So this study by Rex et al. Actually cruised a ship in this area and sent up ozone sondes along the way. They found very low levels of ozone, which I think there are some reasons that we might not believe the very low ozone here, or at least not as low as they said. Though it is very clean, it's generally the cleanest area within the tropics. And so we wanted to understand, is this area of low OH, or the OH hole, as they called it, does it truly exist? If it does, there's a lot of implications, because in this region, it's very convectively active. So you have the lofting of these biogenic ozone-depleting substances, things that are short-lived, like dibromomethane, that if they got to the stratosphere, they could destroy ozone there. But usually they're so short-lived, we don't think they make it out of the troposphere. But here, since it's so convectively active, if they shoot right up to the stratosphere without encountering OH, because OH is so low, then this could have repercussions for stratospheric ozone. So that's just a little segue to say why we're interested in OH. But I'll very quickly go over the results of this box modeling study so that we can get to some other interesting results. So here we're looking at the box modeled OH. So we're calling this the observationally constrained value of OH versus a global model, the ChemChem model that I mentioned before. And this is a little bit of a shotgun blast. So there's decent correlation for measurements, at least, that shows that OH in the box model and from the observations is generally higher than the global model by about 30%. And we did a lot of other box modeling sensitivity studies to show that a lot of this is due to an underestimate of NOx in the global model. So this is in the very remote region. We seem to measure more NOx than what the global models say exists there. There's also a role of formaldehyde and actually an opposing role of acetaldehyde here, but I won't go into that too much. But generally, we're quite concerned with this large underestimate of NOx in the global models. Now, we have an additional aircraft campaign, the atmospheric tomography mission, that provides us with an even richer data set to explore. So in case you're not familiar with ATOM, this took place starting in August 2016. It flew in each season over the course of 3 years, though we're only focusing on the first two deployments, in summer and in winter. And so the DC-8 airplane on which this took place flew starting in California. It flew up to Alaska and then performed a transect all the way down the Pacific and then up the Atlantic Ocean. And all the while it was performing profiles. So these little squiggly lines represent the airplane just constantly diving and then ascending to near the top of the troposphere. And so we really have a great survey of the background state of the atmosphere from this campaign. And in this case, measurements did include OH. So we have a lot more power to understand what's going on, though still the uncertainties on the OH measurement are about 30%. So they're useful, but with a qualification there. But what we have found is incredibly useful for understanding OH is a proxy called formaldehyde. Formaldehyde is generated when you have the oxidation of VOCs. So when OH reacts with something like methane or isoprene in a more continental region, it will go on to produce formaldehyde along with other cascade of species. But as a result, we can use the fundamental chemistry to relate formaldehyde mostly with the production of OH, though if you do a little bit more work, you can get an absolute concentration of OH as well. But in general, we find that this relationship holds pretty well from the ATOM data. There are some cases, such as these red points, where we know the relationship falls apart. This is the case for biomass burning plumes, so those are excluded from the analysis. But in general, for the free troposphere, we think we can understand OH production using formaldehyde as a proxy. So in this case, if we have formaldehyde columns, we can infer what an OH column might be. And it turns out we do have formaldehyde columns from the ozone monitoring instrument, OMI, on board the AURA satellite. And this this measures total formaldehyde columns across the globe, except where it's not sunlit, like the poles in this case. And it is approaching a limit of detection, but we do find that with enough averaging, there is enough signal there to understand the spatial differences in formaldehyde. The columns from OMI agree well with inferred columns from the ATOM data. So we think this is meaningful. So what we do is we apply the relationship that we showed before to these formaldehyde columns to get these OH columns, or we go on then to get a column averaged OH concentration. That's what's being shown in this case in units of molecules per cubic centimeter. So these are numbers that anyone who studies OH will understand. And it's really, really the first time we've gotten these OH observational constraints at a global scale, albeit for only background regions. The thing that I mentioned before with fires, that relationship falls apart, also falls apart when you're over land and you have a lot of VOC emissions. So there's more work to be done. And I'll mention this last result too. So since we did this analysis for both the summer and winter seasons, we can show the OH dependence on latitude. And you can obviously see it shift quite a bit with season. But it's very interesting that if you average these two seasons, you get a northern hemisphere to southern hemisphere ratio of OH that actually favors the southern hemisphere. And I didn't mention it, but this is another issue in global models. Global models tend to show a lot more OH in the northern hemisphere, and we don't think that is true. So we're trying to figure out why are the global models wrong in terms of the northern hemisphere to southern hemisphere ratio. And hopefully this new proxy can start to shed light on why that is. Also, if you were to average the OH concentration over the globe, albeit for only the remote regions, you get about the same OH numbers in both seasons. You get right at 1 × 10⁶ molecules per cubic centimeter. So that seasonal cycle I showed you earlier, where methane lifetime really gets a lot shorter in the summer season, we don't think is necessarily the case, at least not in the remote troposphere. It's possible that over land, that OH is much more important there, and so you get a seasonal cycle over the land, over the continental regions, if you were to include those. But we think this is a very interesting proxy. We think that it could use some refinement. So we have plans to go in and, for instance, see if we can quantify the OH to formaldehyde relationship over land if you know things like the VOC concentrations. There's also some details regarding like the seasonality. The CO is different in each hemisphere and with each season, enough that you might want to tailor the relationship a little bit more than we've done so far. But ultimately, we're hoping to apply this to the full OMI record and to understand how might we improve our global models based on this type of proxy. All right, so I'll just end with these concluding remarks very quickly, and that is understanding OH is a challenge. I think you've seen enough evidence, hopefully, that shows that OH is difficult to understand. But we can start to understand the pieces of the OH puzzle if we start to interrogate the models, the aircraft data, and the satellite data in appropriate ways. But truly, to get at this question, these big, outstanding questions that no one has been able to answer yet about how much OH is driving methane trends and so forth, I think it will take something like this formaldehyde proxy I just discussed, the combination of satellite and in situ data to really get at the bottom of these questions and understand this interesting issue. So with that, we have papers on all of these projects that I've discussed, so feel free to look there for details, or I'm happy to answer any questions. And I'd also like to put up these acknowledgments for the various funding sources, starting in grad school and going now through my appointment here at ESSIC. So thank you very much.
So you showed in the models there were big differences in how much UV they thought was reaching. Do you go back to them and ask them what they're using for stratospheric ozone, or?
So we have looked at the stratospheric ozone. Those seem to be pretty consistent between the models. What we think instead is happening is the cloud cover. So clouds are likely scattering the UV as it comes down, and depending on how the photolysis code, treats the clouds, maybe it scatters more or less for a given cloud, and also the cloud cover itself varies a lot between the models. So we think that's more the issue.
So you said for the for the aircraft measurements where you established the formaldehyde OH correlation, you had to exclude the biomass burning plumes?
Yes.
One question is why? And second is, did you do that for the formaldehyde columns from satellites?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, we excluded the biomass burning plumes because those are associated with a lot of VOCs. So as biomass burns, it's emitting all of these other hydrocarbons, whereas our relationship is really predicated on methane and CO being the main reaction products with OH. So as OH starts to react with these other things, it's undergoing chemistry that we're not accounting for. But then in the satellite product, we did not exclude the biomass burning regions. We're averaging over the course of a full month. So at least they might be a little bit transient in nature, so those plumes may or may not be there. But I think moving forward, that's something we're definitely interested in starting to account for more carefully.
Any more questions?
So in your neural network analysis, you indicate that you only trained the neural network only for one year. I'm actually surprised. I mean, if you train it for a different year, you might get totally different results.
Yes, yes.
So you need to have a much longer period in order to do that.
Right. That's something we would be interested in doing. Unfortunately, the training process is the part that's really time-consuming. We actually have two papers on this. So the first paper the second one that was published in 2017, we only had 1 year of output from a group of, I think, 8 models in that case. And so there, of course, we were constrained to 1 year. But now that I've expanded to the larger group, I started with the same method, but then I discovered, oh, we have this so much more model output that we can play with. It occurred to me at one point that, yeah, it would probably be informative, if not to train over all the years, at least to maybe start with the beginning point and end point.
Or you can train half of the data and then half of the data. That's a long data set. Probably train this with the first half and do the validation with the second half.
Sure.
A related question is, you kind of dismiss the result of the CH4 as a sensitivity, which kind of surprising because you started off as OH, as being a tracer related to CH4, and your result, and you explain in terms of the CH4 being a normalized quantity. But can you get around that problem? It looks like the neural network is a very strong, powerful tool, but if it's inherently unbelievable, as you said, this is kind of a downer in the very exciting result. You say, oh, this is not helping. I thought the neural network would help.
Yeah. So I think if we were to go to that, what you said before of training over all the years, a single neural network would then see a much wider breadth of methane values. And so it would be more feasible to use absolute methane values as inputs rather than normalized values. So I think in that case, it would probably give a more meaningful result as far as the methane effect on OH for this neural network analysis. Unfortunately, just logistically, there's no funding for this work right now, so I'm having to wrap it up probably a little bit more prematurely than I'd prefer. But there are ways to improve upon it for sure.
To the big question about the impact of the OH radicals on the methane trend. So is there any like a trend for the OH radicals, I mean, for the like past 10 years?
Any trend,
OH?
right?
Yeah.
So let's see, I don't believe I have the plot here, but the models all show a very steady increase in OH from the time series I've analyzed, the 1980 to 2015 time frame. And like I showed here, a lot of that reason we think is from water vapor and ozone, as well as JO singlet D to some extent, and NOx. So if OH is really going up over this time frame, it would cause the methane lifetime to go down. The methane would be lost more frequently. So the fact that methane is still going up, despite this increase in OH, might be even more alarming, I guess. But this is something, again, I haven't this analysis is all model-based, but the previous analysis I showed, that was tied to observations, though I think there's a lot more work to be done here as well. It's a hard problem. But in general, we think OH is more well buffered from this analysis.
Any more questions?
So at the very beginning, you had a couple of lifetimes, and you said, here's the lifetime from models, and here's the lifetime from observations. How do you get a methane lifetime from methane observations in the atmosphere?
So that is a tricky thing. So you don't get it simply from methane. You actually will use things like the methylchloroform I mentioned. So that's 11.2-year observation-based lifetime.
Oh, that's from the Monska methylchloroform?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, well, it includes methylchloroform as well as other constraints like the isotopes of methane. That's another big thing people are focusing on, is understanding based on the global distribution of methane and the isotope changes in that methane, they can start to infer how OH has changed. And that's probably the main focus right now. Other people have looked at CO as well as CO isotopes. Qing Liang in our lab, she's looking at a combination of like fluorine-containing compounds as replacements to methylchloroform. But there you have to look at kind of 2 or 3 species at once to do this inversion of OH. So it all traces back to chemical inversions. And some people do like a Bayesian inversion based on that. I'm not as familiar with those statistical methods.
Any more questions? Well, thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks for your attention.
We have another seminar next week. Wait, you can clap. I don't want to interrupt the clapping.